I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now, because this is not just another trade agreement between allied nations, not just another resource development partnership that will generate economic benefits, and certainly not just another example of countries diversifying their international relationships. What we are watching is Canada quietly forging a $600 billion strategic resource partnership with a consortium of Asian democracies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia, that fundamentally restructures global supply chains for critical minerals, rare earth elements, and energy in ways that make American participation optional rather than essential. I have spent decades watching power from the inside, arguing constitutional cases, observing how resource control shapes geopolitical power in ways that military capability alone cannot. And I am telling you right now, the Pacific Democratic Resource Alliance announced in Vancouver represents not just economic cooperation, but a calculated reordering of which nations control the materials that will define technological and military supremacy for the next 50 years. And the fact that this alliance was negotiated in complete secrecy until the moment of announcement reveals just how determined these democracies were to present the United States with an accomplished fact rather than a proposal that could be disrupted. So let me ask you three questions. When Canada commits to supplying Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan with guaranteed access to lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, and uranium worth $420 billion over 20 years, creating supply chains that deliberately bypass American processing and distribution, what does that do to American leverage over allies whose advanced manufacturing depends on these materials? When Australia redirects $180 billion in mining investment toward infrastructure serving Asian markets through Canadian ports, rather than continuing to route resources through American-dominated Pacific shipping, what happens to American control over Indo-Pacific trade flows? And when the entire alliance is structured with explicit provisions preventing member nations from weaponizing resource access, a direct response to American threats to use control over materials as geopolitical leverage, what message does that send about whether democratic allies trust the United States to act as a reliable resource partner? Systems don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly through moments like this. These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time. For more than 70 years, the United States positioned itself as the essential intermediary in global resource flows. Not because America produced all critical materials, but because American companies, American financing, and American logistics controlled the processing, distribution, and trade of resources even when extraction happened elsewhere. Canadian uranium went through American enrichment facilities. Australian rare earths were processed by American companies. Asian manufacturing depended on supply chains where American participation at some stage was unavoidable. The system functioned with extraordinary effectiveness for American strategic interests, not because of ideology or sentimentality, but because it gave the United States leverage that transcended military power. When allies depended on American-controlled resource flows, they couldn't afford to deviate too far from American preferences on other issues. It was boring, predictable, and phenomenally advantageous for maintaining American global influence. The assumption embedded in every strategic plan, every alliance framework, every geopolitical calculation was simple. The United States would remain the indispensable node in critical resource flows because the infrastructure, the capital, and the technical expertise required to bypass American systems were too expensive and too complex to replicate. That assumption of indispensability, that boring predictability that gave Washington leverage over allies regardless of military presence, has been systematically dismantled by a coalition of democracies that concluded American resource leverage had become American resource weaponization, and decided the costs of building alternatives were lower than the costs of continued vulnerability to American coercion. What triggered this moment wasn't a routine policy adjustment or a gradual evolution in trade relationships. It was a series of American actions that made continued dependence on American-controlled resource flows strategically untenable for allies. Not temporary friction that could be managed through diplomacy, not rhetorical excess that could be dismissed as posturing. A comprehensive pattern that combined threats to restrict critical material exports to allies who didn't comply with American demands, suggestions that resource access should be conditioned on Allied support for American policies, weaponization of rare earth processing leverage during trade disputes, and most critically, the appointment of officials who publicly advocated using American control over resource processing as geopolitical leverage. The breaking point came when a senior administration official, in remarks to a defense industry conference, suggested that allies dependent on American rare earth processing should remember that dependency when they're tempted to diverge from American strategic priorities. That statement forced Allied strategic planners to confront a reality they had been avoiding. American control over critical resource processing created vulnerability that could be exploited at any time. And if that vulnerability existed, then eliminating it became a strategic imperative regardless of cost. Canada's calculation was remarkably straightforward, as was the calculation by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia. Option 1, continue depending on resource flows that touched American processing, accepting that this dependence could be weaponized whenever Washington wanted leverage on unrelated issues. Option 2, pool resources to build complete supply chains, from extraction through processing to manufacturing, that functioned independently of American participation, accepting significant upfront costs to eliminate permanent strategic vulnerability. And that is the line these democracies chose to cross. The line where the cost of building independence becomes cheaper than the cost of accepting permanent leverage. Within weeks of the announcement, the effects began cascading through global resource markets in ways that revealed just how comprehensively the alliance had been structured. The rare earth element provisions came first. Canada committed to expanding rare earth mining and building processing facilities that would supply 85% of Japanese, South Korean, and Taiwanese needs by 2030, supply that currently goes through American or Chinese processing. The $127 billion investment in separation and refining facilities in Canada would create capabilities that only the United States and China currently possess at scale. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. The lithium processing commitments followed immediately. Canada would build battery-grade lithium refineries serving Asian electric vehicle and electronics manufacturing. $94 billion in facilities that would eliminate dependence on American lithium processing that had been used as leverage in recent trade disputes. South Korea's battery manufacturers, which had been subject to American export restrictions during trade negotiations, would have guaranteed Canadian lithium supply that couldn't be weaponized. The cobalt and nickel provisions revealed the alliance's strategic depth. Canada committed to developing massive cobalt and nickel deposits in Ontario and Quebec, resources that had been uneconomic to develop when American-controlled global markets set prices. But guaranteed long-term contracts from Asian manufacturers made the investments rational. Japanese and South Korean companies committed $73 billion to joint ventures developing these deposits, specifically to eliminate dependence on American-dominated cobalt trading that had been used to pressure allies. The uranium arrangements were particularly significant for geopolitical leverage. Canada, which possesses 8% of global uranium reserves, committed to supplying Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan with nuclear fuel, supply that had previously been enriched at American facilities, giving Washington veto power over civilian nuclear programs. The new Canadian enrichment facilities, backed by $68 billion in consortium investment, would eliminate that veto. Allied nuclear energy programs would function regardless of American approval. The infrastructure investments demonstrated the scale of commitment. Australia committed $180 billion to port facilities, rail networks, and shipping infrastructure specifically designed to move resources to Asian markets through Canadian Pacific ports rather than routes touching American logistics networks. The new shipping corridors would reduce American ability to monitor or interdict resource flows during any future crisis. Canada committed $156 billion to Arctic port development, rail connections, and processing facilities that would serve alliance members exclusively. The infrastructure wasn't being built for economic efficiency. It was being built for strategic independence from American-controlled logistics. The financial arrangements revealed how seriously allies took the strategic imperative. Japan committed $143 billion to the alliance. South Korea added $127 billion. Taiwan contributed $94 billion. Australia's $180 billion brought total commitments above $600 billion. These weren't loans or speculative investments. These were strategic commitments by governments determined to eliminate American resource leverage regardless of cost. The alliance included provisions for emergency resource sharing, joint strategic reserves, and mutual defense of supply chains, treating resource security with the seriousness typically reserved for military alliances. And here's where the administration's fundamental misunderstanding becomes clear. They treated American control over resource processing as permanent structural advantage that could be weaponized without consequence. But control over processing is only valuable when producers and consumers have no alternatives. The moment Canada and resource-rich democracies decided to build processing independence, American control became temporary rather than permanent. The administration assumed that the costs of building alternative processing would prevent allies from pursuing independence. But they miscalculated the value allies placed on eliminating strategic vulnerability. Building $600 billion in redundant infrastructure seems expensive until you calculate the cost of permanent leverage that can be weaponized at any time. As the disruption spread, something unusual started happening that should have alarmed American strategic planners. Major American resource processing companies began reporting to investors that they were losing long-term contracts to Canadian facilities that didn't even exist yet. MP Materials, the largest rare earth processor in the Western Hemisphere, warned that customer diversification toward Canadian facilities threatens our business model. Albemarle, a leading lithium processor, acknowledged that Asian customers are accepting higher costs and longer timelines to secure supply chains that don't depend on American processing. These weren't market fluctuations. These were strategic decisions by customers willing to pay premiums to eliminate American leverage. Republican senators from states with resource processing industries began demanding hearings. Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming, watching uranium enrichment contracts shift toward Canadian facilities, gave a floor speech that was remarkable in its alarm. We are watching allies who we assumed depended on us deliberately build independence from American resource processing. This isn't about economics, this is about trust, and we've destroyed it. Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, seeing rare earth processing investment go to Canada rather than Alaska, told the Energy Committee that we've spent years threatening to weaponize our processing capabilities. Now allies are paying billions to ensure we can't. The intelligence community response revealed deeper strategic concern. A classified National Intelligence Council assessment, portions of which leaked, reportedly concluded that the Pacific Democratic Resource Alliance represents the most significant erosion of American geopolitical leverage since the end of the Cold War. Control over critical material processing has been a pillar of American influence over Allied behavior. That pillar is being systematically eliminated by allies who view American resource leverage as American resource threat. When the intelligence community warns that a pillar of American power is collapsing, that's not political analysis, that's strategic assessment. But the alarm revealed something deeper than immediate economic losses. The alliance demonstrated that American leverage over allies had become so aggressive that those allies were willing to pay enormous costs to eliminate it. The $600 billion wasn't being spent because Canadian processing was superior. It was being spent because American processing came with political strings that allies found intolerable. That's the difference between partnership and dominance. Partners accept some dependency because they trust it won't be abused. When trust disappears, even close allies will pay almost any cost to eliminate dependency. And here's what they're beginning to understand. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is understanding how power actually works in modern resource geopolitics. For decades, American global influence rested on two pillars: military capability and resource control. The first gave the United States the ability to project force globally. The second gave American policymakers leverage over allies because dependence on American-controlled resource flows constrained Allied policy independence. When those two pillars reinforced each other, American influence was extraordinary. Military capability protected resource flows, and resource control gave leverage that multiplied beyond what military capability alone could achieve. What the current approach is doing systematically undermines the second pillar, while assuming the first pillar maintains American influence regardless. Military capability remains formidable, but resource control is being deliberately eliminated by allies building independent systems. And once you understand this framework, everything makes sense. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and Canada looked at those two pillars and realized something profound. Resource control only creates leverage when alternatives don't exist. And if American policymakers are willing to weaponize that control, then building alternatives becomes rational regardless of cost. They're not arguing that Canadian processing is more efficient than American processing. They're arguing that independent processing that can't be weaponized is more valuable than dependent processing that creates permanent vulnerability. Once resource control is replaced by resource independence, the leverage is gone permanently. And here's the rewatchability hook that most analysis misses. The real story isn't that Canada is building resource processing capabilities. The real story is that American allies concluded that American resource leverage had become so aggressive that spending $600 billion to eliminate it was rational, demonstrating that leverage only works when the leveraged party believes maintaining the relationship is less costly than building independence. And American behavior crossed the threshold where building independence became the cheaper option. For 70 years, American resource leverage was accepted by allies because American behavior was restrained enough that the costs of building alternatives seemed prohibitive. But restraint has been replaced by explicit weaponization, and allies have calculated that $600 billion spent once is cheaper than permanent vulnerability to American coercion. You can't force resource dependence. The supply chain restructuring is happening in ways that will prove devastating for American leverage assumptions. The rare earth processing relocating from American facilities to Canadian operations. The lithium refining being built specifically to avoid American control. The uranium enrichment creating independence from American nuclear fuel leverage. Each of these represents not just current processing capacity, but future supply chains designed to function permanently without American participation. This affects American geopolitical leverage if you're a policymaker who assumed resource control created influence. This affects American resource companies whose business models assumed allies had no alternatives. This affects American strategic position because leverage over allied behavior is being systematically eliminated by allies determined to escape American coercion. This affects every future negotiation where the United States assumed resource leverage would constrain allied independence. Diplomatic infrastructure isn't built for headlines. It's built for the boring reliability that makes dependence acceptable because partners trust it won't be weaponized. and that infrastructure is being systematically demolished in favor of explicit leverage threats that taught allies the costs of building independence are worth paying. And this is where it becomes impossible to find a clean exit from the trap that's been constructed. The administration has two options, both damaging. Option one, attempt to disrupt the alliance, perhaps by restricting American technology transfers needed for processing facilities, pressuring Canada to abandon the partnership, or threatening trade retaliation against member nations. The consequences would be catastrophic. Every disruption attempt would validate exactly the Allied decision that American partnership means American coercion. Member nations would accelerate investments to ensure independence is achieved quickly. Other allies watching would conclude that any American-controlled resource flow is a vulnerability requiring elimination. The alliance would succeed faster and more completely because American opposition proved its necessity. Option two, accept the new reality, acknowledge that American resource leverage is being systematically eliminated, and attempt to compete on reliability rather than control. The consequences here are different but equally damaging to American leverage. Accepting that allies can and will build complete independence from American resource processing represents a fundamental shift in American geopolitical power. Every future negotiation would occur without the resource leverage that had constrained Allied behavior. Most devastatingly, acceptance wouldn't reverse the investments already committed. The $600 billion is being deployed, the facilities are being built, the supply chains are being established. Resource independence, once achieved, persists for generations regardless of American policy changes. The administration is trapped between disrupting the alliance, which accelerates its success, or accepting diminished leverage, which confirms American resource control is optional rather than essential. But here's what makes this truly devastating. These allied democracies didn't just build resource processing capabilities, they accomplished something extraordinary. Not through hostility toward the United States, not through adversarial posture, not through any aggressive action, but by making American control over critical resource processing optional rather than essential, by demonstrating that when leverage becomes weaponization, even close allies will pay enormous costs to eliminate dependence. And those costs are rational when compared to permanent vulnerability to coercion. They did it by pooling resources, by committing to long-term contracts that made uneconomic investments economic, by building infrastructure specifically designed to function without American participation. And in geopolitics, that's the most devastating outcome of all. Not to lose leverage through superior force, that can be contested, but to have allies deliberately, systematically eliminate your leverage by building independence specifically to escape your control, to watch them spend $600 billion for the explicit purpose of making American resource weaponization impossible, to see them succeed in creating supply chains that function better without American participation than with American coercion. That era is gone. The era where American control over critical resource processing created leverage that constrained Allied behavior is over. The era where allies accepted dependence because American behavior was restrained enough to make alternatives seem too expensive is finished. The modern geopolitical environment doesn't reward control without restraint. It doesn't reward leverage without trust. It rewards the partnerships that provide resource security without weaponization threats. And when those partnerships exclude you because your behavior made inclusion too risky, the leverage you thought was permanent disappears. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and Canada understood that. They built their alliance around that understanding, and it's working. And once processing facilities get built, once supply chains get established, once strategic reserves get accumulated, once independence gets achieved, it does not reverse itself. Every ally is drawing conclusions about American resource leverage. Every resource-dependent nation is drawing conclusions about building independence. Every partnership is drawing conclusions about whether American participation creates security or vulnerability. Every future crisis will occur without the resource leverage that previously constrained Allied behavior. What we are witnessing is not a temporary diversification that will revert when American policy moderates. What we are witnessing is the permanent elimination of resource control as a pillar of American geopolitical influence. Eliminated not by adversaries, but by allies who concluded that American willingness to weaponize that control made independence worth any cost. And the tragedy is that this was avoidable. The United States had every advantage. The existing processing capabilities, the technical expertise, the established relationships, the trust built over decades, all of it favored continued American centrality in critical resource flows. All that was required was the basic recognition that leverage only works when exercised with restraint, that threatening to weaponize resource control encourages exactly the independence building that eliminates that control, and that allies will pay enormous costs to escape permanent vulnerability when that vulnerability is explicitly threatened. You cannot threaten to weaponize resource leverage and expect allies to remain dependent. You cannot suggest that material access should be conditioned on political compliance and expect partners to maintain supply chains that make them vulnerable. You cannot treat resource control as a weapon and expect allies to accept permanent exposure to that weapon. The people paying the price are not the architects of the strategic catastrophe. The people paying the price are American resource companies losing contracts to facilities that don't exist yet. The American workers whose processing jobs are being eliminated as allies build independence. The policymakers who will negotiate future crises without the resource leverage that previously constrained Allied behavior. The nation that will discover its global influence was more dependent on resource control than military capability, and that control has been systematically eliminated by allies determined to escape American coercion. Reliability is the true currency of power, and that currency has been systematically devalued in favor of explicit weaponization threats that taught allies the $600 billion cost of building independence is cheaper than permanent vulnerability to American leverage. The question now is not whether this can be reversed. The question is which other pillars of American influence will collapse as allies discover that building independence from American control is worth almost any cost when American behavior makes dependence intolerable.